This is lecture 24. I call it Western Civilization and World Context. This is Mahatma Gandhi on Western civilization. He said, quote, "I believe it would be a good idea." I don't know if this is amusing or if we should cry over it. It's not quite clear what Gandhi means here. We can interpret it maybe one of two ways. He may be saying that it would be nice if the people in the West were actually civilized. Or he may be indicating that there is an absence of Western civilization, that the world has encompassed European civilization so that a distinctly Western civilization has vanished. So we're going to talk about this problem of Western civilization in the context of world history. I've already mentioned early in the course that world history was in fact created in opposition to this focus on Western civilization. World history, of course, shifts the focus from Western Christian societies to the rest of the world that does not necessarily have Western traditions and are not necessarily Christian. The West is generally considered to have been born of the classical cultures, Greece and Rome. But of course, as we know, the classical era extends far beyond merely Greece and Rome. Rationality and faith are shared by both Christianity and Islam. Homosexuality, in the guise of pederasty, was a feature of the classical era, especially of the great Greek city-states. This institution has not survived into the modern era. Myths that the modern democracies in the world today extend backward to classical civilization are more rhetorical than they are reality. But by grounding our traditions in classical Mediterranean culture, this allows us to think of our political system that we value today as having very deep and valued roots. Christianity, of course, is often identified as part of the Western tradition. Yet, of course, there are pockets of Christianity around the globe as well. Certainly the Roman Catholic Church is a worldwide organization. Features unique to Western civilization, a parliamentary tradition born out of the early modern era is a reasonably unique feature. This idea of representation, republicanism, democratic societies. The political power of Western merchants is also unique. Of course, these Western merchants were sort of the last merchants to sort of table up to the great worldwide bazaar, sort of led by China and Persia and India. But Europe will finally join this circuit of commerce. In the West, trade tends to be less constrained by the state than in the other civilizations we've looked at. In the West, there is an increasing confidence in man's ability to dominate nature. In the West, family structure is a bit different in that children, as we go forward in time, children will marry at a later age than, say, in India or China. So you see an emerging sort of individualism. The individual conscience is going to come into play here, especially after the Reformation and the Enlightenment of the 16th and 17th centuries. Some of the big themes of Western civilization: the West has long been a society that imitated the more advanced civilizations of Asia. This trend is now going to begin to be reversed. The Crusades taught the West about urban life, about fine fabrics, spices, technology. The West had long had confidence that its religion, Christianity, was superior, but they also realized that they lagged behind the East in virtually every other way. The West was long dependent upon Muslim traders from Europe all the way across Eurasia to China. The West long suffered from I guess what we'd call a balance of payment issue. How to pay for silks and spices, the pepper and the nutmeg and the cinnamon, the porcelain, the lacquer work, you name it, all of these commodities, some of them quite luxurious, that come from the East. The West has often had difficulty figuring out how to pay for these things. The West did not produce things that were desired elsewhere. So you can see the balance of payment problem. An example, Vasco de Gama sailed to India in the late 15th, early 16th centuries. He took with him Western textiles and some metal pots and other sort of crude Western products, hoping to trade with the Indians. The Indians weren't interested in these inferior Western wares. In fact, if Vasco da Gama had not taken gold with him, he would have left India empty-handed. So let's talk here about these factors leading to the emergence of the West as a major player on the world scene. Remember that the West's leading competitors, both Byzantium and Arabia, are weakened after the turn of the first millennia, after the Crusades. The West borrowed technologies from China and elsewhere, gunpowder, lateen, sails, the compass, what else? Paper. And the West made good use of these technologies. The printing press, invented in China, was taken to the West, where it was adopted by Gutenberg in the middle of the 15th century. And this is going to fundamentally change Western history. Literacy is going to allow people to read the Bible on their own, to form their own individual opinions. This, of course, is going to go run hand in hand with the Reformation, and will reach its fullest fruition in the Enlightenment in the next century. The Crusades were an initial exposure of the West to Eastern cultures with its superior commercial culture and finer consumer goods. Remember also in 1492, the Reconquista in Spain is finally successful in driving the Muslims and the Jews out of the Iberian Peninsula, across the Strait of Gibraltar, back into North Africa. This Reconquista, of course, tends to give Western Christians even more confidence in their culture. Remember, too, that Western and Muslim scholars, especially Muslim scholars quite often, preserved and sampled these classical texts and kept them alive so that when the Renaissance does emerge in Western society, these classical texts are available to them. Remember that the scientific revolution takes place in Europe. It does not take place in the Muslim lands. It doesn't take place in India or China. A couple of reasons for this. First, during the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe created the, how should we put it, sort of the autonomous university, a community where scholars were unusually free to dispute and argue about the fundamentals of life. This does not take place in the East. Second, there is an increasing flow of information via both the printing press and the oceanic voyages that Europeans are undertaking. These voyages reveal new lands, new peoples, new animals, new plants. How to explain this? The old authoritative texts do not explain it, in fact, don't even mention it. The Bible, Aristotle, Plato, these traditional classical texts begin to lose their authority because they don't have answers to new questions. I should mention that European merchants, bankers, city people, urban dwellers, they play a far more prominent role in politics and in war than is common elsewhere. European bankers especially insisted upon grants for mining rights or other revenue-producing privileges, as security for their loans given to the monarchy. So you can see commercial interest, private interest, state interest all work hand in hand here. Now in China, from the Ming Dynasty into the early 20th century, we're talking 500 years here, the examination system, the traditional Chinese examination system, focused on moral, literary, and aesthetic attainment. China is going to begin to look inward as the Europeans look outward. Chinese scientists are going to increasingly find little institutional support. Free inquiry and radical ideas often aroused state opposition in China. The knowledge gained from Xinghe's expeditions made only a modest impression on China. We'll talk about this in more detail. The great Ming treasure fleets are going to be suspended in the early to middle 15th century. And the West is now increasingly inquisitive and aggressive, while the East becomes more complacent and more withdrawn. So a couple of conclusions here. The coming European age of discovery, as we usually call it, will fundamentally shift power and cultural influence from the East to the West. Western inquisitiveness, Western search for ideas lead to voyages of discovery. These lead to the creation of little Europes around the world, an increasing willingness to face the fact that they don't know the answers to everything and are willing to go out and try to discover these answers. The older traditional authorities, like I said, do not have answers and are not adequate to confront the new questions revealed by all these new lands, new peoples, new plants, new animals. So that's an attempt to put Western civilization in world context. Thank you.